In this chapter, you will learn how industrialization affected American society in the late 19th century. You will learn how people migrated from the countryside to cities, and people from other countries came to the United States. The essential questions in this PowerPoint are: what economic, social, and political changes did urbanization bring to American cities? And what were the experiences of immigrants in the late 19th century? In the last chapter, you learned how American industrialization increased its pace in the decades following the Civil War. Accelerating industrialization contributed to the process of urbanization, the movement of people from the countryside to towns and cities. Several factors contributed to the rapid urban growth. The introduction of new farm machinery such as Cyrus McCormick's reaper, which cut and bundled grain, greatly reduced the number of farm jobs. Farmers and rural laborers sought work in towns and cities. At the same time, the rise of industry had created many new job opportunities. Workers were needed in factories, mines, and workshops, and for services like transport. Americans were also attracted to cities by their cultural opportunities, popular entertainment, and rich variety. Finally, the explosion of urban growth was further fueled by unprecedented levels of immigration. Urbanization led to physical changes in the landscape. Trees and fields were replaced by wood and brick buildings and by paved roads. American cities mushroomed so quickly that municipalities, or cities, authorities, were often unable to deal adequately with all of their problems. Cities grew haphazardly. Streets were often not wide enough to bear the increased traffic. Horse-drawn cars crowded the streets, making movement almost impossible. Factories and trains polluted the air, while sewage sometimes contaminated drinking water and spread disease. Cities lacked the ability to deliver essential services like clean water, garbage collection, and public schools to so many residents. As cities grew, whole families crowded into tenements. Single-room apartments, often without heat or lighting, frequently many families shared a single toilet. Here's an example of one of those city streets. As you can see, the amount of traffic, whether it be on foot or by horse-drawn carriage, congested the roads. Also from here, you can see the outside of the tenements where the people lived. City governments were often run by corrupt political machines. The leaders of these machines were known as political bosses. Either the boss or a small group told the workers and supporters of the machine what to do. The machines often provided jobs and other services to immigrants and the poor in exchange for their votes. The power of the political boss depended on his ability to dominate voting and to control the agencies of municipal governments. The machine also often had the support of other local business leaders. By controlling elected officials in the local government, political bosses were able to hand out government patronage jobs to reward loyal workers. The bosses then used their control of City Hall to make illegal profits on city contracts or by collecting bribes. For example, Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in New York City controlled thousands of city workers and influenced the operations of schools, hospitals, and other city-run services. Tweed benefited from the support of the Irish immigrants. He controlled or bribed lawmakers to pass laws favorable to his interests. Tweed often overpaid himself on construction projects and land sales, stealing millions from the city. While the political machines were corrupt, they did play a useful role. They helped immigrants settle into their new homeland, finding housing and obtain jobs. They also helped immigrants become naturalized citizens and even provided money to help them through hard times. The political machines were often the ones to get a street paved, extend a water pipe, or approve construction. But these services came at a very high price. In this slide, you see Boss Tweed in the upper left-hand corner and Tammany Hall in the background. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a political cartoon of Boss Tweed. In the late 19th century, European immigrants flooded American cities in search of work and places to live. In many of the largest American cities, European immigrants even came to outnumber native-born Americans. Immigrants have always come to the United States for a variety of reasons. History often divides these into push and pull factors. A desire to escape oppression, poverty, religious discrimination, or ethnic persecution pushed immigrants out of their homelands. A belief that America offered freedom and economic opportunity as well as ties to relatives already living here generally pulled immigrants to these shores. They saw the United States as a land of unbound opportunities. The immigrants who fled oppressive regimes in Europe yearned to live in a democratic society like the United States. In this slide, you see two pictures. The one on the left is in Ireland during the Great Potato Famine. And then the one on the right is of immigrants, from what I can see, looks like they're on a boat coming to the United States. And in the background, you can see the Statue of Liberty. Before 1880, most immigrants to America came from parts of Northern Europe, especially Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany. In general, these immigrants were Protestants, except for a large number of Irish Catholics. Most of these early immigrants spoke English. Patterns of immigration changed in the 1880s. The construction of railroads across Europe and the appearance of large ocean-going steamships made the voyage to America more accessible to many Europeans. Most of these new immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Greece, and Russia. They were often Catholic, Jewish, or Orthodox Christians rather than Protestants and spoke no English. In this slide you see three photos. The one on the left is for the F. Missler Bremen. This is a ship that most likely came from an Austria-Hungary German area. And the two pictures on the right, typically when speaking of immigration, you think of Ellis Island in New York. This is actually in Galveston. The upper picture is the quarantine station for new immigrants. And then the one on the bottom is the actual building where they service new immigrants coming into through Galveston into Texas. Typically, the immigrant coming through this area were a German, Polish, Austria-Hungary immigrants. A lot of the towns in Texas, if you haven't noticed, are German names. A lot of them did settle in Texas. Immigrants in the late 19th century usually faced great hardships, beginning with their passage to America. They traveled in steerage, or in an open room below the waterline, often with their life belongings in a single bag. On a clear day, they assembled on the ship's deck for sunshine and fresh air. Most first arrived in New York City, where they were processed in a vast government center on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Those with tuberculosis or other diseases were sent back. The initial hardships. The new immigrants either stayed in New York City or took trains to join their relatives in other parts of the country. Most settled in cities. They were usually poor, dressed differently from other Americans, and were unfamiliar with American customs. They moved into crowded tenement buildings and worked at unskilled jobs for long hours at low pay. They often faced hostility and discrimination from native-born Americans and even from other different immigrant groups. Despite these hardships, there were often a strong spirit of optimism among many immigrants. Many had already survived far worse conditions in the countries where they came from. If America was not everything they had hoped for, they appreciated that there were new opportunities for both themselves and their children. Ethnic ghettos. To cope with their problems, immigrants usually settled with relatives and others of the same nationality in ethnic neighborhoods known as ghettos. The immigrants felt more comfortable around those who spoke the same language and who followed the same customs as themselves. In their own communities, immigrants could speak their native language, attend their own churches and synagogues, and be among relatives and friends from the old country. Some of these communities even published newspapers in their own native language. However, living in these ethnic ghettos also isolated immigrants from the mainstream American life, making it harder for them to adopt new customs. While some adult immigrants attended night school to learn English, most were too busy working and caring for their families to spend time learning a new language or culture. It was left to their children to learn English and become Americanized, learning to dress, speak, and act like other Americans. These immigrant children eventually became assimilated, similar to other Americans. America was seen as a melting pot in which immigrants were melted down and reshaped. America's public schools generally assisted in this process. Often, Americanization was accompanied by conflict. For example, immigrant parents might desire an arranged marriage for their children, while their children insisted on finding their own marriage partners according to American customs. As a flood of immigrants grew, hostility to immigration also mounted. Nativists, or those born or native to the United States, wanted to restrict immigration. Nativists believed that people of other races, religions, and nationalities were inferior, and that the new immigrants were especially inferior to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Americans. Nativists feared that the new immigrants could never be fully absorbed into American society since they lived in ghettos and spoke their own languages. Finally, nativists argued that immigrants working for low wages would take away jobs from other Americans. For the most of the 19th century, there were no limits at all on immigration to the United States. Anyone who was healthy and could afford to come here was permitted to immigrate. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was the first federal law to restrict immigration to the United States. It reflected American prejudice at the time against Asians. In California, political leaders blamed unemployment and general decline in wages on the presence of Chinese workers. The law temporarily banned the immigration of Chinese workers and placed new requirements on the Chinese residents already living in the United States. These residents had to obtain a special certificate before leaving the United States if they planned to re-enter. State and federal courts were denied the ability to grant citizenship to Chinese residents. American leaders carefully negotiated with the Chinese government in order to enforce this ban. In the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the children of Chinese immigrants born in the United States could not be denied citizenship. This part of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the court held, violated the 14th Amendment. In this slide, you see Hester Street on the Lower East Side of New York in 1902. This was a Jewish ghetto. In the previous slide, you saw how the streets are narrow, and they are the same. But in this location, it was predominantly a Jewish community.